design meetup. Currently a software engineer here at Bryan, but tomorrow's my last day. So after that, I will be a test automation engineer at a company called Freshly downtown. We are hiring. We are a Ruby shop with a bunch of Cypress that we use for our tests. So hit me up if you're interested. Yeah, and actually, I guess let's go around the room and do a quick, like, who we are, and then we can start. We'll pass it over to Bryan and we can get going.
Kush? My name is Kush Tajgasi. I call myself a fake engineer. What I do is I design EVs and I do Java programming on the side. You'll see me on forums.
Justin James. I own a company called Let Your Nerd Be Heard, where I teach people how to do public speaking, and I do a whole lots of coding and testing.
Peter Nguyen, I'm a software engineer architect for Phoenix Indian Medical Center. Pretty much full stack development.
If you hurry, you can join me speaking on Wednesday in Dallas. I'll be at the PPAI conference, and then next week I will be at Codapalooza in Kentucky.
I'm Bryan. I'm a director of engineering at Elevate Tickets. We're in Tempe, just over the freeway here. We do ticketing software for some of the largest festivals events in the country. Yeah.
Dave Robertson. I work with Elevate Tickets. We work together, and software developer.
Jen Whittingham. I am actually a UX designer. Work with a lot of coders and design systems and UI elements. And I currently work for a company called Tallwave, and at the end of the month I'll be working for Meetup. So,
Jinzhou Zhang, Node.js developer at just do research. We do transportation consult work for governments.
I'm Scott Slack. I'm a software development SDT, and been recently playing with some IoT stuff, including the circuit playground with some Python.
My name is Alex Novello. I'm right now working at Optum as a software developer. I actually went to school for mechanical engineering, but I love programming, so yep, that's my thing.
Cool, thanks everybody. Bryan, if you want to take it away, then feel free.
All right, I am presenting this presentation. Wow, that's a bad way to start off. I am Bryan.
You got it.
Yeah, I'm a software developer, local to Arizona, and I like going to Meetup events and getting free food. So far, I got a soda.
Thank you.
Yeah, so today's presentation, I was going to be working on Storybook testing. Mostly, for those of you who don't know about Storybook, it helps isolate component-driven development. It helps to build components in isolation, where we could focus on making sure that whatever APIs you give it works as intended for every solution you can come up with. And let's keep the solutions limited for those components. So, the keyword for Storybook is story. A story involves a narrative of a certain individual, in this case a component, and entails the journey of this component. In Storybook, we are given the tool to explore components and their potential in some stories. It is fairly interactive, while others are not so much. Then there are components that are the amalgamation of other components. For my example, I'll be showing a button because, well, buttons are the first thing you really need to style appropriately. And I'm not going to worry about styling. because I'm not that good of a designer, and I only wanted to present on capabilities of Storybook. And yeah, so Storybook, storybookjs.org. They've been around since React got started and Meteor was picking up and then died down, but somehow we got this tool. Something I wanted to focus on was the new format that they've been describing, and it's the component story format. And this is mostly to help developers to start taking in a generic way of writing out how they should present their components. Because there are multitude of tools that exist nowadays, like React Style Guidist, and what we could offer now is something less, less ritualistic, because there are certain functionalities that we just have to keep repeating. When you write certain code, it gets tedious to a certain point. But with component story format, it takes away certain fluff. Where if I show down in this link's example, if you guys want the link on this article, I'll send it to you.
You put it on the Meetup.
But yes, I'll put it up on the Meetup. Component story format. It should also be Googleable at this point. And these were the big points in detail. Mostly, for me, what I found interesting about the component story format was that it was something that I was starting to think about much later on as I was developing with Storybook for the past year. And I always saw that I was writing out a function to generate the component that I need to look at. And this component, maybe a button, was taking in certain properties, and I wanted to see what those certain properties looks like for each button. And for this example, yeah, I'll just skim through. So, as you can see in this piece of code snippet here, there was the old adage of saying stories of the description of what button we're looking at, and then applying all the various ways of displaying the button. And as you can see in these final two lines here, it's a function that gives me a button. And in this example here that looks like HTML, but it's not really, that allows us to create our component for view. So what we're migrating towards now is this new feature of saying export default with some sort of meta properties, an object that something that says the title of this file, and it's taking away that stories of portion. It's taking away that .add portion, and now we're just exporting the function of what we want to look at. And now, and from this example, it already gives us the subtext, the subtitle of text, instead of putting it as another parameter. That's now a function name. And of course, as you add more components, as you add more stories, you're adding more functions, and all these functions can be delivering that specific use case. So now that it's just a function and there's like nothing that was of Storybook, but besides the outside where we actually run the builds, we can now utilize any other tool in any fashion. And since it's just a function now, I was planning on trying out testing it, because you're only testing the function. So now our components are literally translated to function, and that's where I can show some small example of what I've got so far. If I can figure out my position in the mouse. All right, So no, I'm just opening this little example here
Okay.
because I don't want to show my editor. It's too much information. So the goal for I had an element here. Did that disappear? Yeah, there we go. Okay, that was weird. So yeah, I'm messing with latest builds of Storybook. So essentially, I'm playing with beta, and yeah, you find out weird quirks here and there. So let me get started with the example case of what we're seeing here. As you see, there's the Storybook logo itself, little drop-down list of all the capabilities that we could see on looking at next component or past components, and you can even go to full screen mode. I don't remember how to get out of it. Crap. Oh, okay. All right. And some small modifications on maximizing and minimizing the view of said elements. So the story that I start off with is button and the default HTML. It's really, that's all it is. That's the basic button. In case you guys haven't remembered since the last time we styled CSS on it, I'm not going to put any CSS on this because, well, I had a hard time coming up with what to choose. So we're stuck with default. But we don't want to be looking like that. And we want to be tracking the capabilities as well. Let me get to, I lost my mouse. Where did I put it? Oh, there you go. Right, let me just save some changes here. All right, so now we got a little bit more information. So what this element was, it was just the basic button. Now with default here, it's a different kind of button. And it's hard to describe it without looking more towards inspecting it from here. So this tells me that this is a React element, a button defined by React. And then there's the normal button. So yeah, that's a little bit about how React works in the Chrome browser plus an extension from React DevTools. More on that from the React talks maybe tomorrow. Who knows? So getting back to these story bookmarks, they look like bookmarks. So you start off with default, and right now there's a click me. It does nothing because there is no on-click event on this button. But with the default with click event, it should have an event on it. However, when you inspect it, with the Firefox DevTools, it will tell you that it has an event. But of course, you don't see that in the actual element markup if you were to ever to output this out as HTML. So when I go into the console here, it should say something. Click. Also because I didn't utilize a certain feature within Storybook. So that's the example from the default with click event. And then there's the disabled variation. Now, as you can tell from default and disabled, well, if you can tell, it's hard to tell with grayscale. But essentially, disable allows us to have control over whether a button will actually click or not. And we should know how that should look like. And also with a disabled with a click event. So, like with default, but without the default. Oh, fudge. So, because it is disabled and it has a click event, we won't actually enact the click event because of those keywords that existed within HTML lore. And yeah, it does nothing. So as you can tell from all of these various bookmarks, we have all sorts of capability from just a simple button. And we need to be able to cover every single scenario on how this will look. And this is only the example of button. This will also be in the creation of building out your form. And when you build out your form, there will be more weird issues that go about in the future. For one instance, if you were to include button in a form and you were to click button, would it submit or would it not? It would submit. And that's only because we need to provide the type submit. But in form, it's default. So it gets a little bit tricky to make examples for this without really trying it out. And I was also going to provide some tests as well. If I remember where I put it.
Do you have to define all of these cases, or did it inspect it and know that that's the events the component emits?
For the
Default with click. Did you
oh,
have to
these
enumerate all
are
those?
things I initially created myself.
Okay. So those are all the functions that you exported out of that file?
Yes.
Okay.
And I show you the example. If it's readable enough. Collapse this and then drag this over. And that's not very much readable.
There you go. Is that a Dreamweaver?
No, this is the Visual Studio Code editor. Yeah, VS Code usually is what it's called because it wants to distinct itself in comparison to Visual Studio. So don't be downloading Visual Studio unless you know what you're doing. So as you can see as what we did see from Storybook, we have our meta properties, the title being button, and I also had given it parameters too, which I will cover later. And then the basic example of HTML button. This is the rendering of how button would be usually written out in HTML, but it's also in a JavaScript file, so that's usually a no-no. However, with the advent of React and compilers such as Babel, we now have a new format called JSX, which allows us to put HTML-like code into JavaScript. And that's what allows us to say that it should be translatable to design. However, we need to continue building better practices in class naming as well. And that's another story for another time. And so, back to covering on what this function is. HTML button was given a meta property in itself, and I had overridden the original name to HTML button to HTML. If I didn't have this, and then I go back to this one, this should update to saying HTML button, and it did. Okay, that was a bit faster than I realized. I come with that, save that, go back. Okay, it's back to HTML. Okay, that is fast. I wish my development process for my usual work is that fast. Along with the simple change of removing HTML_button.story equals this object with the name of HTML, we could also change the content of our functions. HTML language, because I couldn't think of a better thing to change it with. And yeah, there's the change. Maybe I should put it side by side just to show that happen. If I can line up properly. There we go. Okay, I'm not even on it. Okay. Alright, there we go. Old button. So as you can see, with the development tool playing at the same time as we can see our web browser, any save that we make, it's an instant change. And this can be helping us in development process for certain components, for isolated components. Components that we're only worried about this certain feature. Let's say we are redesigning the form itself and it involves a lot of styles, and you have to go to a certain page with a certain amount of clicks. If we could just isolate the form's visuals itself, we could just be developing from Storybook and then moving the adjustments to just there, instead of having to triple click into that place where the form is at. And that helped me a lot in my development for the past year, especially when your environment is very much resting on the QA environment as well. So if your data is connected to your local, then it's like, oh, everything's down again, so I can't go to that page. But that's based on my experience. It may also be different to yours. But I do like that it's fast.
Does it shallow render or does it deep render?
I think from the moment it saves, it just renders it completely.
Okay.
However, it does, from what I recall, this is utilizing Webpack and using the hot module server. I forgot what the full name was, but yeah, Webpack, the stuff that we don't like touching. Yeah, a lot of abstractions along the way. It finally paved towards building a better tooling. And right now, what I most appreciate about how this format works is, because it's a function, I can test it like any other function on basic example. And I had to do a little bit of hacking for my small example for button clicking, because I could not think of a better solution at the moment. Let me see if I have the actual file in. Let's see, button test. Right. Okay, so I have my tests here. Right. So I covered a bit of the UI, and now I'm covering a bit of the actual testing. So like any other JavaScript file nowadays, we have to import all of our requirements and then also import the thing we're testing. For this case, I put everything under the stories object. I import everything as stories. And then for the test, I expect the default to render. And then I have to enforce the render to happen, and then I need to check if the actual render took place. And I was foolishly messing with a different testing library than what I usually use at work. So I was trying to get used to this example, the get by text click me, because that's currently the text that I was using for the button itself. So if I were to rerun the test for, actually, if I were to rerun this test, wait, maybe I should just use the features that comes with VS Code. Let's see, if I go to definition of that story, okay, that's pretty neat. And then I change the text here, save that. That should break my test. All right, there we go. Thanks, VS Code, for all those plugins. But it still doesn't give me a very coherent answer. But you know what? We made this test. I made this test bad. So when certain characters change in content, if someone wrote code like this, it would be very quick to say, yeah, you broke something. We don't know why. So that's more towards architects, but not my job at the moment. I'm just like, yeah. So that is not what I want to look at. I want to look at stories. Undo that example, save that. I just keep on clicking everywhere. So yeah. So with that in mind, that's how we could explore on making these tests work with Storybook. Originally, when I worked with Storybook, the tests were separate from the Storybook. The tests were focused on just the component. And it wouldn't be that much different. However, when it comes to the actual playing of certain events, you may need to start experimenting with how things are mocked. And with the Jest.js framework, it allows you to mock certain implementations of a supposed library that you could look into. Let me see if I can pull up that article specifically. Jest.js mock. Let's go with mock functions. Nope, that is a terrible one. Where is it? Yeah, a little hard to read through. Takes a while to get through. And okay, so this one, I think I'll mess with this one example. So as you can see in this example here, we are doing a const mymock equals just.fn. That's the usual pattern of how you define a mockable function. So how I was using it was just that. However, I needed to, since this was a story and not actual production code, I can just mock out the example from within the function itself and just have it carry over as probably not the best practice. So when I go back to my test, you can see in this line that I actually use the just.fn. And that's a way of mocking certain functionality. And in this example, I'm just mocking out the click event. While this example just shows that I'm actually hitting the event of clicking, it does not show a good example of what would happen when you are going through a service. So when you are utilizing services that require a lot of waiting, it's going to take some time to make up a certain pattern. And there are ways to go about it. Timing functions are usually a challenge for those that get started on it. And we have timer mocks for that. So when we do get to explore with Jest, it'll also learning how to exploit how the function could be applied for the component. So that's most of what I could cover on how the button is being utilized in this creation of our storybook. Are there any questions on anything specific? So, although my example was pretty small in the testing example, for some reason, I think I might have broke something else on this. There was other things that were supposed to be there. Let's see. Maybe if I rerun this, maybe it'll work out. Actually, maybe I'll just check out the old branch that I put now. I forgot what the name changing the branch. Ah. If, well, that doesn't help me. Oh well. Just trash all of that. Right. And then Storybook. Okay. Right. Yeah, I guess I might have broke that. So yeah. Although my examples are pretty pale comparison to certain design systems that exist nowadays, one such example that I remember is IBM's Carbon system. Carbon design. And this is pretty much my goal in mind for what I want to do for my company, if it loads up fast enough. Alright. So as you can see here, there are all sorts of examples of components, and for this example, a form that actually looks pretty decent, and things like UI shell with a header base with navigation. Because everything can be in a sense a component, and any sense of a component being that there can be multiple ways to handle it based on certain properties. And as you can tell with the UI shell, there's multiple ways of showing a header. And then there's the example of header with side navigation, and of course, all sorts of add-ons in the Storybook. I was hoping to show some of the examples with more of the just tests. However, more than just testing functionality, we also ought to test for accessibility as well. And at this moment, it's running some sort of a scan on the elements themselves to test whether it is compliant. If it's not broken. But again, they do have a plethora of components with all sorts of details. So I'll also send up this link if anyone is interested in looking at this more thoroughly. For Storybook is not just a way to explore components, but also capable in bridging some gaps between design systems. And that's one of the details that I want to look into very much so.
Is there any way to tell if it is broken?
Well, we could pop in the console log and find out. It might not just work in Firefox. Because I am messing with Firefox nightly, so probably should have used Chrome. Sorry.
Do you just prefer Firefox?
I'm trying to adopt it more. More in the purposes of the current development tools focusing towards CSS. While the Chrome browser is still the most performant and also the most memorable to me, I do see a lot of strides happening in their development. It is something new to play with, but yet not available on IE11 ever. So there are limitations to what you have in accordance to your support of the audience. For my company's case, it's IE11 and up. I'm glad that we're not on IE9, because then I would have no flex. But with that said, you can still play with Storybook for your own tooling and also come up with the CSS styling as well, and then try to run it on IE11. That's something I have to try.
So you'd make a function that designs the style to this?
So aside from designing the code for style, that's a separate matter. What Storybook is, for the most part, is a component explorer. How you define your components, how you style your components is up to you. And it's gonna be a lot to discuss on, especially when it comes to folder structure. Because from here, everything looks to be linear, one folder. But again, you have to actually click in and see what options there are. And there's also, very conveniently, maybe I should have done that a while ago. If you were to type combo box, you can see the default, and you can pick the options here. So yeah. So regardless of how your folder structure will be, if it's searchable from this angle, let's say if I were to do the search of items as components, well, that's convenient.
Would you style it in function Storybook or on the outside in HTML?
Are you talking about the design of
CSS style,
okay.
just like a Bootstrap setup or something?
So if you want your components to look like that
All the
of
same,
Bootstrap,
so, yeah.
you will have to make your elements within your component defined as such, or to utilize libraries that are already defined for you. Regardless of how you define your style, it will try to put it out there, as long as you've set it up appropriately. But from the get-go, you can keep things pretty trim, not worrying about style and just worrying on the elements itself, and then you can apply style later on. I do want to try exploring more on how to design things better, and also to understand accessibility a bit better. It's something that has been a new goal for me in mind. Are there any other questions on design?
I'm a back-end guy, so I got nothing for you.
Yeah. Speaking of backend, there's also other additional add-ons within Storybook's ecosystem that allows us to play with GraphQL. So in the future, maybe when you want to deploy this example when you deploy your own Storybook as its own website, you can also have it tied into the GraphQL system and also mess with it from there. I know that they have that listed in their add-ons. Pretty sure they do. All the various add-ons in here, and they're all documented well enough to try out. Let's see. Community add-ons. I'm pretty sure it's here somewhere. Data Apollo. Apollo is the example case. So yeah, available, open source, and all the documentation that it requires. It only takes a little bit of elbow grease. But yeah, I wonder if he has an example out. It looks like you play the example on your own. Oh, here's, I think, is this, nope, that's probably just more details. Yeah, that's just more documentation. Okay. So that's only from one aspect. And Storybook is still just a tool for you to demonstrate your components. And those components can be tied into GraphQL and along with Redux to manage to have state management. So there's a lot to explore when designing components. But you have to start off small. And for my example, it was with the button. So hopefully that gives you some inklings of what can be done on the developer side to try to approach design and to get better tests done.
What's the process of setting up Storybook? Like after you've npm installed it, before you get to here, what are the other steps?
So the usual steps for Storybook have been listed in the documentation of storybookjs.org. And from the Quick Start Guide, they provide a very streamlined way of seeing what your code looks like and then attempting to put the best variation possible. So if it were React, Vue, Svelte, or neither, it will attempt to install the appropriate libraries. However, you could just install it based on the documentation alone and get started from there. The CLI is not required. I found that just including the Storybook and then including this amount of code. Let's see, I have written out, I keep losing my mouse. Okay. Go back there. I'll just delete that guy. Alright. Close this for now. So this example here is all the requirements for putting up a storybook. The requirements being having Storybook React. I was trying the beta, so this should work with 5.1. And Babel, that's the requirement as well. And then dependencies, React and React DOM. And then from having Storybook React, we're given this in our node modules directory to run start Storybook. So that's all that's required for the package JSON. And for the
What's the -f public?
Yeah, that part I think was extra. But if we were to do a build process instead, you could include the public directory, and then that's how they were able to push out some amount of their code up in there for Carbon design.
Does that have include external style sheets and external images that my components need to load?
So the way to configure, like the way they did it for, do I still have that open? They didn't change that part, did they? No, that's me. Click. All right. So what they did for the Carbon component Reacts? Wait, no, I was reading the wrong spot. The Carbon design system that IBM developed. If you want to customize the style, it's all within the documentation for, let's see, theming Storybook. So that way you can give it a touch of your own style. And however, with the -s, I'm pretty sure that stands for static. That probably may be where you want to change your icon to something other than the Storybook's icon.
Okay.
So yeah. And in here, for adding custom head tags, you could also include more base styling for getting started on what your visuals would look like. There's more configurations available to us, including the standalone options. And there's more details within testing from here. And another one for automated visual testing, which I want to try out as well, where it literally takes a screenshot and does an actual check on the actual imagery. And like any other ecosystem, there are other paid options as well. Chromatic seems to be the one that I have inklings that they are very much involved with the development of Storybook. So that's all that I got for now. Thanks for sitting with me and trying to get us to understand more about Storybook.
Thank you so much, dude.